I'm Andrea Petzel. I'm with Broadview Planning. Myself and Valerie Pacino are helping to facilitate these conversations. We will get going with a lot of our meeting details in a minute. Valerie's going to start sharing our screen, and I'm going to have Shelley say hello and do our land acknowledgement.
Could you enable sharing? Sorry, Andrea.
No problem. Go for it.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our January meeting. We're excited about the agenda today. And in just a second here, I'll do the acknowledgement. Valerie, if you wouldn't mind moving it to that slide. Thanks so much. Okay, here's our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the role of traditional Western-centric planning practices have played in harming, displacing, and attempting to erase Native communities. We commit to identifying racist practices, to practice allyship, and strive to center restorative land stewardship rather than unsustainable and extractive use of the land. We humbly recognize that we are on Indigenous land, the traditional and current territories of the Coast Salish people who've reserved treaty rights to this land, including the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and Still-Gamish. We thank these caretakers of the land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial.
Thank you, Shelley. Okay, so here's an agenda of how we're going to be spending our time together today. We're going to do a quick recap of the work that's been done to date and kind of what we've been working on since our last meeting in October. We have Scott Demansky here from SDCI to talk about the permit timeline data that they pulled together. We're going to do a quick recap and have some discussion about the final pieces of the design review process in other cities. And then we're going to report back to you on the results of the focus conversations that Valerie and I did with all of you. And then we also held those with staff. And then the last bit of the agenda, we're talking about our next steps, both how we're going to respond to the SLI and then what this group should do in terms of weighing in on some of the recommendations that we're going to have moving forward. The conversation today, we have so much to get through. So we are going to talk about recommendations. And I think the question that's on the table is, does this group want to meet again one last time to look through those and talk about them? Or do we want to do that all online, responding and editing Word documents? So just something to think about. We'll save the last 10 minutes of this conversation to go over that. And that's how we will be spending our time together. We're not going to do introductions because I think we all know each other by this point. And from focus conversations in our last meeting, I think Valerie and I feel like we know who everyone is. If you want to drop hello in the chat, your favorite New Year's resolution, go for it. But we're going to skip introductions with the exception of Scott Demansky from SDCI, who is here today again, like I said, to talk about the permit timelines. So let's see. If you have any questions or please feel free to drop them in the chat. Everyone is muted right now. Raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted. Like I said, we have so much to get through today. We're going to save time at the end of each section to go over Q&A and have some discussion. So I'll be watching the chat, try to be as responsive as possible, particularly to clarifying questions. But again, some of the meaty pieces of conversation we'll save till the end of each section. I think that's it. My next slide, I think, is our ground rules for today's conversation. Please assume best intentions from everybody and be curious about what folks are saying. Engage openly and honestly in respectful dialogue. Please acknowledge also and embrace each other's diversity and make space for others to share. And then when you are sharing, please make sure to use your I statements and speak from your perspective only. So I think that is it for our discussion agreements. So very quickly, I'm going to have Valerie just talk about, as a recap, for people who may have missed the October 26th meeting, kind of what we did there, and then also what we have been working on since October 26th. Valerie. She can't unmute herself. Hang on a second. Go for it.
Thank you. So we last met on October 26th, and at that meeting, we previewed a draft of the community attributes report on design review and potential impacts to housing costs. We also had an early look at best practices from other jurisdictions. Since then, we've been quite busy. We've been working on focused conversations, both with staff and with members of this committee. We conducted an analysis of permit times and other permit data. And then we finalized both the community attributes and the best practices report. We'll be covering all of that at this meeting, and all of that is in service to answering the questions from the statement of legislative intent. The SLI questions are on the screen now. I won't belabor the point because I'm sure you've read them all, but just as a reminder, they're up. And we're going to start with permit time analysis. Andrea?
Yeah, I'll just ask Shelley if there's anything you want to add to that, the work that's been done along the way since October 26th.
I think this about covers it. Yeah, we sent out a couple of reports to the group last week, and we're still working with the other consultant, Community Attributes, on finalizing the report that discusses things that affect housing costs. So we will send that out as soon as we can, and I apologize that it has not been ready yet.
Okay. So that's just a quick overview of the things that we've been working on. And if there aren't any questions, I think I will turn things over to Scott Domansky, who's a principal economist at SDCI. He's going to walk through the information on the permit timeline summary report, which everyone got in advance. It's a lot of information. So we'll walk through the slide deck that he's got. And then again, if you have any clarifying questions, please drop those in the chat. And we will save time for sort of the bigger questions for the end of Scott's presentation. And Valerie will be advancing the slides, Scott, so just let her know when you want those to be full.
All right, thank you. So hi, everybody. My name is Scott Domansky. Like I said, I'm principal economist with SDCI. My primary role is forecasting permit fee revenue for the department to make sure that we're covering our costs. But a big part of that is understanding how long all our processes take. So this involves high-level performance reporting for both land use and construction permits. And with this SLI, I work with Shelley to kind of take a deeper look at the design review process in particular, to try to get a better understanding of how long the design review process takes. So a bit of what I'll talk about today. First, the goal, why are we looking at permit timelines? A little bit on our methodology, discuss what impacts permit timelines. We'll look at our findings, and then we'll end with our big takeaways. All right, so what were our goals? Why are we looking at permit timelines? Kind of three main objectives here. First, to better understand overall permit timelines and how different permit types compare. We also want to better understand the time added by design review by looking at other timelines that don't involve design review. And then we also want to understand the time spent with SDCI versus the time with the applicant, because not all of the time that it takes to process a permit is in SDCI's court. All right, so what are we looking at? What's our methodology here? We have our counts over, we looked at a total of 539 permits. A little over half of those were design review. So, majority are streamlined design review, but we also had a good number of administrative design review and full design review permits. The time frame we're working with is permits between July 2018 and December 2022. So this kind of lines up with our current design review policies, and also it nicely lines up with when we moved over to Excella, which allowed us to get a lot better milestone data out of the Excella system versus what we could have gotten out of the previous Hansen system. And what we're looking at is the early design guidance process through either the related master use permit for full design review or administrative design review, and or the related construction permit with streamlined design review, because the streamlined design review doesn't require the MUP process. And for all three of these, the clock that we're looking at starts when the early design guidance application is accepted and the fees are paid, so that SDCI can then begin the early design guidance review process. The endpoints that we'll be looking at, like I mentioned, the FDR and the ADR, those involve the MUPs. So for the MUPs, we're looking at two endpoints. First is when the decision report is published, because this is kind of the end of SDCI's work on the process. And then we're also looking at the MUP is issued, or when the MUP is issued. The difference between those two is basically the appeals process, which can have a pretty wide range of duration, pretty wide impact of how it affects the timeline. And also the applicant needs to pay up all their fees before the MUP gets issued. For SDR, it's a little bit different because that bypasses the MUP process altogether and just goes straight into the construction permit. So we'll be looking at either when the land use review is completed on the MUP, or else, and also when the construction permit is issued. And then we're also going to be looking at other MUPs, medium to complex complexity, things that are kind of comparable to the design review in terms of complexity. Our timelines are going to be a little bit different there again, because there's no early design guidance process. So we're looking at MUP intake to issuance on the other MUPs. All right, so what are the impacts to permit timelines? And this is kind of broad. This extends even beyond design review. The main impact is the number of reviews on a permit. So there's a number of different review locations that a permit can go through. A lot of these happen in parallel. Examples are land use, zoning review, MHA, incentive zoning, city light and public utilities. There's some reviews that occur outside of SDCI, sustainability, housing, ECA, geotech, shoreline tree, transportation, historic reviews. These all can occur on a master use permit. So that's one major factor of complexity. This sometimes involves coordination with other departments and or agencies. There can be different code requirements between projects, which can impact the complexity. And like I said, there can also be an appeal at the end of the master use process, which can have a pretty large impact on the timeline of a permit. All right, so moving on to the findings now, we're going to kind of work through the process. So I'm going to start with the early design guidance process here. And this is measuring, like I said, that intake for early design guidance when the application is complete and all fees are paid. So SDCI can begin the reviews. And this goes through when the guidance report is distributed on the early design guidance. And these are all measured in calendar days. So we're not eliminating like holidays or weekends here. This is purely like how long, calendar day basis. SDR is taking about 66 days or about 2 months. ADR is taking about 90 days or 3 months. And the full design review is taking 111 days on average, or just under 4 months. So you can see here, this is a theme that's going to kind of repeat throughout this presentation, is that as complexity of the process increases, also so does the time required to get through the process. So how much time do these spend in the early design guidance phase relative to the total calendar time of looking at, the early design guidance start to either the MUP or the construction issue? Somewhat close between all three of them, and but here we actually have kind of an inverse relationship where the EDG share of time decreases as the complexity increases. So for the SDCR, it makes up 19% of the total time of the processing for a streamlined design review, whereas ADR, it's 15%, and FDR, it's 16%. And then there's a time period between the early design guidance phase and when either the MUP or the construction permit intake begins. So the MUP or construction permit intake, this is basically when all the materials for that portion of the process are pulled together and the fees are paid up on it, so SDCI can begin the review on those. This we saw kind of a surprising, I would have expected these to all be pretty similar, but we're seeing about a 21-day gap for SDR, a 74-day gap for ADR, and a 48-day gap for FDR. I'm honestly not sure why the ADR is longer. I kind of looked through permit by permit, and it just kind of seemed to be that they were. This can be this is all time that's with the applicant, but this can also be impacted by intake appointment availability. So, you know, if there's a line to get in the door at SDCI, that can push the timelines longer. But I didn't really see any reason why the ADR should be longer. But that's what we're finding in the data. So that's, you know, what we're presenting is what the data says. All right. Now moving on to our total throughput time. So again, I'm gonna have a lot of caveats here on, you know, what we're measuring, but going back, you know, I'm going to start with the ADR, the FDR. This is measuring from the beginning of the EDG process through either the MUP decision published date or else the MUP issuance date. So the yellow bars are through the decision published date. We're looking at 604 days for the administrative design review or 694 days for the full design review. And then when we extend that timeline out to the MUP issuance date, we're looking at 641 days for the ADR and 739 days for the FDR. The reason that gap exists between the decision published date and the issuance date is because once the MUP decision is published, there's a 14-day appeal period with the possibility of appeal. So not every MUP has an appeal process, but the ones that do, they can last from a couple weeks where it's dismissed by the hearing examiner to a full-on appeal that takes several months. So there can be a really wide gap there. But what you're seeing here in that gap is kind of the average of when we look at all the permits in our sample, what results in the gap there. Also, there after the appeal process, or even if the appeal gets dismissed, the MUP applicant still needs to pay up all their fees before the MUP gets issued. So if there's any delay in that for any reason, that's being reflected here as well. Moving over to the SDR, again, there's no MUP component with the SDR, so we're looking at kind of different endpoints here. So we're starting with the EDG intake, and we're going through either the construction permit issuance or else the end of the land use review, because once the land use review is over, really the kind of the design review process is over, but there's still other work that has to happen on the construction permit for it to be issued. There can be other design locations that maybe don't have, or other review locations that don't have their reviews completed. So here we actually saw a pretty big gap. The land use review is typically over within 352 days or just under a calendar year of when the EDG had started. But the construction permit to be issued usually takes 465 days. So that's a gap of a little over 100 days. And I kind of looked into this because that was a bigger gap than what I was expecting. And I found that the land use review typically only takes about 3.3 review cycles total, including the initial plan review, whereas all reviews typically take about 4.5 cycles on the permits in our sample. So usually the land use review is being completed about a cycle earlier than what all the other reviews were being completed. So it doesn't really seem like the land use is what's holding up the construction permits on these within this sample. All right, sorry if I move in a little bit fast, but there's just so much to cover in this presentation that I just want to make sure we get to everything and have some time for questions if you have any.
Also ahead on the agenda, so don't worry.
Okay, cool. Next thing we wanted to look at was the difference between how much time is the ball in our court, so to speak, or an SDCI's court versus how much time is the ball, is the application out with the applicant for either corrections or waiting for fees. So we looked at all three types, and it was actually pretty similar across all three design review types. We were looking at a split of about 39% out with the applicant and 61% in with SDCI for SDR. And for FDR and ADR, those are on the next slide. Our splits are 36 and 64 for ADR and 34 and 66 for FDR. So roughly about a third of the time it's out with the applicant, and 2/3 of the time it's in with SDCI. And just to kind of clarify what we're talking about within our court and versus out of our hands, The time with SDCI includes preparing public notices, signing reviews and conducting reviews, writing design review reports or decisions, processing permits for issuance, and the time outside of our court. That will include scheduling an intake appointment, submitting required materials for permit intakes, paying fees, installing, confirming the public notice signs, and submitting responses to corrections. Not within either the SDCI or the applicant control are the appeals process and also code required public notices. All right, so how does a design review compare to other MUP types? So we looked at a number of other kind of medium to complexity MUP types. We kind of got rid of all the simple ones. There's no like LBAs or short plats in here. You can see some of the more medium type complexities like variance, temporary use, special exemptions, shoreline. Those are all ranging from about 155 to 280 days. So that's quite a bit quicker than design review process. Then when you start to get to some of the more complex ones, it actually gets pretty comparable to design reviews. So particularly SEPA 2, determination of significance, and the council actions, those are looking at over 600 days. So those are kind of in the ballpark of what the ADR phase, the ADR's durations take. And remember, these don't have an early design guidance portion, which we're counting in the design review. So this is just MUP time. And then the ECAs are about 472 days. That's pretty similar to what our full SDR process takes. The SEPA DNS is about 363 days, so that's kind of in the middle. Full design review, remember back, that was about 740 days. So that's a bit longer than all these processes, but a full design review can also contain one of the very complex, like it can contain a SEPA 2 or a council action or an ECA. So it also has like a complex MUP within the full design review process. So it kind of makes sense that that's pushing that a little bit further. Now comparing the time in and out of our court between design review and non-design review, design review kind of falls right in the middle of the range that we're seeing across the other MUP types. Some of the simpler ones have kind of more time in our court because there's just kind of less back and forth. The more complex ones have more time out of our court. Like in particular, ECAs have 52%, SEPA 2 has 53%, so that's about 50-50 split. Whereas design review, that was all more of a 2/3 to 1/3 split of time in our court versus time out of our court. So there was nothing really kind of extreme or extraordinary about design review. It kind of fell within the range that we were expecting here. All right, so finally, kind of the big takeaways that we found looking at our timelines. Mainly, timelines overall reflect project complexity. You see that timeline increase as you go from SDR to ADR to FDR. Projects that are more complex require more reviewers, greater coordination, and more time with both SDCI and the applicant. Permit time with SDCI versus with the applicant were very similar for DR and non-DR projects, meaning that share is very consistent across all three of them. But of course, as timelines increase, if the shares are the same, that means both times are increasing as well. The percent of overall time for the EDG phase was a bit higher for SDR, but that also has a different process than ADR or FDR. Construction review is a little bit less complex than the full MUP reviews. Overall, the data showed that SDR and ADR had shorter review times compared to the FDR times. So this means in addition to the design review board meetings, which may add time to FDR projects, there are other possible reasons for this difference in time. SDR and ADR projects are smaller in size, usually less complex, and FDR projects are larger in size and tend to be more complex with additional coordination, more complex code requirements, and have more frequently get appealed.
Okay.
So, I think that's all I've got for today. So any questions?
Yeah. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I just want to, Grace had a couple, and I would be curious because I'm assuming if you're asking, you also have some examples. The first question from Grace was, is ADR potentially longer because of back and forth between staff? And then Grace had another question about if a contract rezone and MUP, how much time could be expected. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Grace. Or have any kind of explanation about your experience with administrative design review having a lot of back and forth between.
Well, I was just noting that the slide showed that it was like in the applicant's court for longer. And it's not because applicants just like not knowing what to do or sitting on their hands. There is a lot of back and forth that goes between the planner in perhaps in the guise or in the vein of it will be more streamlined if you show me the drafts back and forth a number of times before we actually submit. But I just wanted to daylight that that's actually a big part of the reason that it sits in the applicant side is that we are encouraged to spend a lot more time in that process with the planner.
I don't have any real specific thoughts on that. Shelley, do you have any ideas on that?
No, that's good information. I wanted to just clarify that this report that Scott worked on is just about the data. It doesn't look at any of the reasons why that data exists. So that would be a separate effort, and we could look at some case studies potentially, if that were necessary, to kind of help inform some of the reasons why. And I also agree, Grace, it would be especially helpful to hear from applicants why some of these reasons. I thought it was interesting to see that, Scott, when you showed that slide of percentage of time that design review projects are out versus non-design review projects, that the proportion that it was with the applicant versus SDCI was about the same. So so that's just interesting to note when there's no design review that there's also that time with the applicant. So, but it would be great to find out, dig into more of why. But this study is just about, here are just the numbers. Here's what we found from permit tracking.
But just, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Shelley, and you can't just look at the numbers and not deduce anything. I think the whole point of this exercise is to look at the numbers and try to understand and deduce the barriers that exist and how we might be able to overcome those or solve those things. And if you don't, wonder and posit, then I'm not sure why we're doing this whole thing. And so I just wanted to share that information of like, it's not because the applicant's just sitting around on their hands, was my point. If you were making deductions about that and saying, oh, well, it's the applicant's responsibility and it's their fault that it's taking so long, that's not actual information. I just wanted to share that.
Sure, I hear you. And I'm definitely not trying to say anything about that, just noting what this study is, and it will help inform our conversations. And part of our conversations, I think, should be, hearing from you all, what are the things that affect that step when it's, for instance, in your hands.
Shelley,
Yeah, and hang on one second. I just want to respond to this really quickly. So we are gathering all of these kinds of insights and recommendations, and we'll talk about this at the end, but these all feed into recommendations. And so I think it's really helpful that Grace is that perspective to help us kind of stitch these things together. So that's kind of exactly what we're looking for, is like, here is the data. What are you curious about? What do you have ideas about? And then that's backed up by a lot of other different sources of information and input from our interviews. And we're just trying to figure all these things out together to come to a set of recommendations. So it's helpful perspectives to have. And I can see other people chiming in with what Grace said in the chat. So I'm not sure who's next. Raising hands would be great. I see Patrick's hand up, so I'm going to go with Patrick.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And Scott, this is really good information. And I agree with you, Shelley. I think we have the data on this. If we look at it from a total involvement, total time frame, I think it would be important to at least acknowledge, even if we don't have hard data, that there is also prep time prior to application. We spend a lot of time with our clients, preparing specifically for EDG and design review. So, I think it's time in our court, but it's necessary time to be able to really get to an application. So as we think about design review, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a total time frame that is exacerbated by that process.
Appreciate that. Tejal?
Yeah, hi, this is Tejal Pastakia. So one thing I wanted to add to Grace's comments was also part of the reason we're encouraged to work through the responses is if we do not, it automatically triggers a second or a third or the fourth correction cycle, which extends the whole process. Your average of 111 days, I was doing my math through all my multiple projects, and since 2018, I don't think I've had a project that has taken 111 days. It's more like 2 years, just for context.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chime in? I see Maria, you have a comment in here. Is there a way to have a dialogue, examples of why planners delay EDG and design review board submissions? I'm not sure I totally understand the comment there.
I do think we should have a dialogue about that, but I also want to tag on to Tejal's comment. It seems, while we appreciate this data, it is interesting and enlightening, that I guess I am not clear if the information is commingled with larger complicated projects, and what those review times are, which are much higher. And so how do we peel that I out from that, which is what Tejal said about her experience in the time. I can say it mirrors exactly what my experience is, but I do bigger projects, probably a little more complex. And for that to be lumped into an easy project that went through, doesn't seem like the data there's too much compressed into one little section. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm in the same situation.
Yeah, likewise.
Maria, where 111 days, I can't remember that. I don't even know if it was a decade ago. I really am, and I've been being absolutely genuine when I tell you I can't remember the last time it was less than 2 years. So I have simpler projects and difficult ones, but they're still roughly the same timeline. So I don't know how this data really where it came from, and yeah, the commingling may be skewing it some.
Yeah. Scott, I don't know if you want to answer that.
So just to clarify, the 111 days, that was just for the early design guidance portion.
That's not what it looked like on the chart. Maybe you could go back and show us.
Okay, let's go back to that, to the 111 days one.
So this is just the early design guidance portion. So the beginning point here was you have a complete early design guidance application, and the fees are paid, so the reviews begin, and then it runs through when the guidance report is distributed for the early design guidance portion.
How do you feel about that?
That's a little over 3 months. And again, I think the EDG process in my experience, and we do fairly complicated projects too, has been around 6 months. So it's been twice the amount.
There is a range here, but this is just what the average is saying. When we looked at those, what is it, 120 SDR, or for FDR it was about 60 or 70, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For the full design review process, I think our early design guidance through MUP issuance, that was about 740 days. So that's about 2 years, what it sounded like you were experiencing. And actually, the Eco Northwest, I think they were looking at about 750 days as well for the full process.
And can I ask a clarifying question for Grace? You said, even so, I feel 111 days is too long. Do you mean it just fundamentally that's the process is taking too long, or that it's too long based on your experience?
So fundamentally, that's like fundamentally, if you just think about like the day that the intake happens, and Chris has a good follow-up question. It's like actually measuring like what is the time duration that passes between the date that the meeting happens and the report is issued to the team. Like that is just too long of a time. Like why can't it be a week or two later instead of months later? Because meanwhile, we're sitting there waiting like, okay, I think we took our own notes. I think we got it wrong or right. Is there any other guidance that's going to pop up that we weren't aware of or that the planner thought of afterwards? That sort of response time, it would be much more helpful if it was more immediate.
Yeah, and I guess Grace, sort of tagging onto that for a second. I mean, we can dive into sort of why the numbers are the numbers, and everyone's going to have different, you know, sort of their own averages and their own experiences. But generally, I just sort of bristle at the idea that it takes 2 years to get a permit, like regardless of why. You know, it's like, and I don't, you know, again, it's like, I don't personally believe that, you know, the design review process is like the critical path. I think when we look at MUPs taking 2 years and you look at the number of different, like that list right there, like MUP reviewers, it's like, there's so many different, you know, moving parts. We have to find a way to streamline the process. And I'm not sure if like automatically just axing design review is fundamentally going to change many of these overall durations. And I think what I just, as a builder of multifamily, just 2 years to get a permit is, I just feel like it's slightly insane. And I wonder if the city has looked at, similar to like the other report of design review in other cities, how long is it taking to get a permit in some of these other cities? Like, I just, like, I don't know, because I don't permit in other cities, or I mean, in other states, but anyway, to me, there's an overarching question of like, why is it taking so long? How can we make it faster? I sort of just bristle at 2 years.
Chris, you're just talking about the MUP. Add the building permit in there, which you as a builder need that building permit to start the work. So add another year longer for that.
Right.
So
and sometimes they're happening concurrent, right, Pat? I mean, you know, they can like some of these times these processes are happening again along a similar timeline, but it's, yes, I mean, this is just MUP, but from an overall entitlement process, it's just, I just feel like we got to be able to do better. And, you know, I will say anecdotally, right, like other, like Seattle schools, I don't believe has nearly, you know, there are other large complicated projects that I know I'm getting now offline or off the rails a bit, but there are ways there are precedents at speeding some of this process up.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I think that's good. It's noted fundamentally that 111 days is taking too long. And that is kind of the heart of this conversation, is like, we're trying to figure out where are the pinch points to a certain extent that can help improve. And we have other things to present to you from the focused conversations. And I don't think this is a case right now where we need to be into finger pointing about who's not doing their job, or is not, or developers coming in more or less prepared. The fundamental point is things are taking too long. Let's be curious about this and sort of think about where these pinch points are. So I appreciate all the perspectives in the chat. Maria's got her hand up. So Maria?
So I'm going to go back a little bit to process with all the comments and the data that was presented, and what I perceive as some flaws in the data. If this set of data and information is going to be part of a package that goes to City Council, for example, or the mayor's office, and there's disagreement that factually it is not accurate, I worry that it's then your whole report is going to be dismissed and attacked by some of the people in this group, because we've already identified some of the inaccuracies in that data and how it doesn't reflect realities. So I just wanted you all to address, what are you going to do with this if there's a significant amount of disagreement with the way the data is presented, what's included in that data, and how you're going to use it if because it seems like counterproductive, then we're all gonna come back and do a minority report or something and say we don't agree with that data. It just doesn't seem very helpful.
Are you talking specifically about this information that's being presented right now?
Yeah. I mean, which is a big chunk of the dialogue about not, I guess you could say disputing, but disagreeing with the content, because it's reflecting an average of many different types of projects. And I would say most of the people in this committee do more complex projects that have significant more delays, and that's absent from any of the data. So how do we solve something if the data isn't even there for us to address?
So I'll let Shelley chime in. I'll just quickly talk about responding to the report. And this is why we do multiple approaches, right? Like there is data, there are sort of the quantitative aspect of things, but then there is the actual lived experience of folks, which we have been gathering along the way, which is the qualitative perspective, and neither really outweighs them. So this is why we're here, is to sort of try to, like I said, stitch this together, understand if we have the data telling us one thing, but people's stories are telling us another, what's that delta and how do we fix that? So that is going to be the crux of our report. And so I had another thing that just slipped out of my mind. I think what would be helpful, there's a couple comments in the chat about data you would like to see. That would be extremely helpful to know, like the timeline from when the design review packet is submitted to the MUP publication date. Great, let's see if we can figure a way out that. So I don't want the narrative that this data is wrong. It is a source, it is SDCI's data, it's what we have. And there will be other elements to support the perspectives that other people are bringing to the table, including everybody on this call. So Shelley, do you want to add to that at all?
Nope, that's basically what I was going to say is if you feel that there are pieces of information missing from this data, further parsing of the process. So we've measured certain steps in the process. And what I'm hearing is that there are other steps that this group feels are important to identify. And then also if there are things that we can't gather through our data, such as your own experiences, those are helpful to understand as well. And then, I don't know if we're going to have time to mine more data between now and the time we have to present this to the Land Use Committee of City Council, but at the very least, the final report could indicate here were places that this group identified as, we need more data about this, or we need more information about the applicant's experience about this.
Absolutely. If there is data that you think would be informative and helpful, we would like to know what that would be. Again, if you can drop it in the chat so that it is written, that would be even more helpful. Any other questions or comments or things that stood out to folks with this?
I have a quick kind of observation. I think Chris or someone on the team said, the most, I think, important finding in this was that the MUP process takes 748 days, I believe. And I think the intent of this, group is to help you figure out a way to reduce that timing. Is there in this presentation or next any opportunity to figure that out? Because I think that's why majority of the group is here, regardless of 111 days or whatever other, timelines identified. The whole purpose of this, a group is to reduce that number from 748 to, I would say, back to the 365 days that we're used to from a dozen years ago.
Yeah, we're getting to that.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or comments or ideas or thoughts? Data you would really like to see? Todd Lee, you put something in the chat. Thank you. That's the amount of effort. Okay. Scott, anything else you want to add to this?
Oh, no, that's all I've got.
Okay. I appreciate that. Okay, so with that, we are going to move next to design review in other cities. And just to sort of put a finer point on the question that Tejal asked about what we're doing to get to recommendations to sort of improve these things. The SLI asked to consider, really under a racial equity toolkit process, all of these different things, from the permit timelines to the housing affordability costs that design review may or may not have, to people's experiences here. It is a tremendous amount of information that we are tracking in terms of just ideas and insights for how to improve processes, and then also from just straight recommendations that we've heard from a lot of different sources, including what other cities are doing. So after this, Valerie and I are just going to do a recap of what we've heard from the focus conversations and then get into a bit about recommendations. That said, and this is what I asked in the beginning for those of you who might have missed, we're not here today to talk about recommendations, but want to have a sense from you is, when we have these recommendations, do you all want to have another meeting to talk through those, or do we want to do them kind of on a Word document and everybody edits back and forth? Not a question to answer right now, but that's how we're going to spend the last 10 minutes, because there's just too much information to present to all of you before we even get to the recommendations, but we will have some recommendations. So with that, let's have Crystal talk a little bit more. And this has been presented before, but we're at a new stage, and so want to just kind of wrap up this conversation about design review in other cities. Crystal.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Crystal Torres. I'm one of the planners that works on design review and lots of other master use permits as well. Okay, we can jump. Perfect. Thank you, Valerie. Okay, so just a quick high level, why do cities have design review? As we've kind of noted before, the design of the built environment affects the way in which we engage with both the built surroundings and one another. Design has potential to enhance experience of the built environment. So whether that be how you move in buildings, how you move around buildings, how we gather in spaces, and then who creates design review. Typically in the cities that we looked at, as well as City of Seattle, during the initial planning phase, there is kind of public outreach and engagement that involves public, city staff, and design professionals. And that usually happens kind of in design charrettes and different ways of gathering kind of visions for individual neighborhood guidelines and overall citywide vision for the built environment. And what does design review provide? It provides kind of a roadmap for moving forward for these shared visions and goals of the city's built environment. And we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what does the report look at? We looked at, it begins to look at several of the items also that we've kind of discussed in the group too, of required versus not required or optional design review. Is there a early design guidance phase or not? Is there public comment or public meeting or not? What is the design guideline scope? And do these other cities, what does equity look like within their process and guidelines? And then we can go to the next slide, please. Let's see. Okay, so last time we looked at Austin, Chicago, and San Francisco. And then today we're just going to provide, again, kind of the same high level look at Portland, Denver, and Boston. So we can jump right into the next slide, please. And I'm just going to quickly kind of touch on process, equity, design guidelines, and then maybe like the key question or takeaway that I thought was interesting. And then as kind of Andrea jumps into our discussion pieces later, those are woven into that as well. So for Portland, I thought, so process, I didn't see a specific EDG phase, but there is a pre-application conference and they had an optional design advice request piece. So if applicants feel that they need that additional assistance before the submittal, they can utilize that. There was an administrative and kind of full design review similar to City of Seattle. And design review occurred within designated areas, mainly central city, and then kind of like urban village similar to Seattle. So where specific kind of growth concentrations happen. The type of design review required, this kind of fell across all the cities too, right? It's based on the size and complexity of the project. Larger projects kind of move into that full design review where there is kind of the public engagement component and maybe the board or commission component. Of note, let's see, smaller projects, and they consider small under 40,000 square feet, can opt into design plan checklist process. And this is a more prescriptive way of, here's a set of standards and you must meet these ones, rather than going through kind of a back and forth. There's just a set, meet these and then kind of move forward, I believe. As far as equity, they list equity as a core value, and they do require community and public outreach. Design guidelines, they also have citywide and neighborhood design guidelines, similar to the city of Seattle. And I think the key takeaway from this one for me was, what does that look like having an optional EDG? And what does that look like to have a checklist of bare minimums in lieu of, smaller projects having to move through design guidelines? So that's something to, think about what that might look like and how that could help or hinder or create barriers or assist certain different communities. And then we can head to the Denver one next. So Denver process first. Again, they have an administrative and what we would call full design review that requires going to a planning commission. Again, the size and location would dictate admin or full design review. Equity, it wasn't explicitly integrated into the design guidelines. And the design guidelines themselves, they appear to be more prescriptive. So some of the guidelines have language that are shall provide. So there's kind of key high priority things that projects need to provide. And then below that, there might be suggested or considered pieces. And again, so for me, I thought that was kind of interesting. What would that look like? What if there were set prescriptive elements and then you had a number of suggested ones? Or what would it look like? Maybe there's a combination where, there's different ways to do it. If you're doing 5 prescriptive, then maybe you need 10 suggested. If you hit all 10 prescriptive, maybe. So these are just different ways to look at how our process could maybe take note from other cities. And finally, we'll go to Boston. One of my favorite cities to visit and eat in. Process-wise, again, they're similar to the city of Seattle. Design review required based on size. The review ranges from small project review, admin, and then again, similar, they have a full design review as well. Required information for each of those different types corresponds to the project impact or the project size. So the bigger the project, bigger impact, more information is being required for each of those. But I thought that's interesting as well, I think. Equity, it's not currently explicit in the guidelines, but they do have public outreach and community participation that is encouraged throughout the process. Design guidelines, in lieu of the design guideline, there's kind of a comprehensive list of submission requirements again. So different project sizes would then have like a set corresponding required submission for each of those. And that's reviewed by the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So looking at kind of Boston and Denver, a big takeaway, I think, for me was, what would that look like if maybe there were different requirements or checklists that occurred with the scale of the project as well? So maybe super small projects would have a really reduced checklist to provide and no EDG, or EDG and just a checklist and then no like recommendation phase. So there's just all these different combinations that we could look at. And I think looking at maybe the information we just saw in permit timelines, and there's been a lot of discussion on EDG, I think looking at these other cities is helpful to see, like, some of them are optional and they just require these specific checklists, but they are more prescriptive. So again, it's just these different combinations that could begin to bring questions or things for us to consider. And then I think the next slide. So we'll just do high level kind of summary of like the process things. The majority of the sample that we looked at did require some form of design review. Austin had an incentive-based program for design review. And that was located around kind of, again, like their central areas or their areas with directed growth. Similar to the city of Seattle, design review types across the board really seem to follow project size. So with increased size, there was a more analysis and more information required from the city. Again, I think that just reflects larger projects have larger contribution and an impact on our built environments. And then equity piece. So equity overall, I think what I was seeing was that it seemed to appear more as like currently an overarching goal and vision rather than explicitly defined in the guidelines. But I would say that, like the city of Seattle, these cities are currently looking at how their design process and guidelines can begin to evolve as we're evolving, you know, with cultural and social norms, again, to reflect greater equity in both the process and the guidelines. So that's something to think about, you know, how could we evolve both of those, right? With that question of like barriers and who is this helping, hindering? And then two, kind of related to that, the city of Seattle has been kind of a leader in innovative planning and policy work, whether it's, you know, design review or sustainability. And so I think we're, it seemed to be like on par with what other cities are doing or where they're at with equity is like, we're all kind of looking at that and asking those questions now, and looking forward to improving that. Design guidelines overall, it seemed like everyone's looking at site plan, exterior materials, and then the review component, the looking at kind of the programming wasn't as straight across the board, but I'm also wondering, something we didn't look at was maybe like street level development standards are just required by zoning, so they don't need to be as dependent in the guidelines. So that's a question too. Would that be more helpful? Have things that are just required for like street level specifically, and less involved in the guidelines. Oh, one thing I thought too about equity, the cities that had equity more called out in the guidelines were also the cities that had greater public engagement. You can see here on that chart. So it seems like those pieces are really intertwined. So as we talk about EDG and public outreach and all of that, what does it mean if we're taking away EDG? Where is that public engagement showing up later? And what's the best way to do that to make it mean something? What's most helpful? Let's see. And then I think, what do I have here? The overall key takeaways were very comparable to these other cities that we looked at. I think the biggest thing is, that's not a shock, is larger projects seem to require design review. Smaller ones, either they were optional or administrative. And then EDG and the prescriptive requirements varied the most to me, where some cities are more prescriptive and others are less. So this to me seems like a good question to look further at, and how that might reduce timelines and help it. And then also checklists, so kind of checklists, EDG, and like public engagement, I thought were pieces that varied in the way that cities approached them. But yeah, thank you, everybody. And I know I went through it really fast, but it was a lot of information.
Well, I'm curious, Crystal, if you had like one or two things that stood out to you from a particular city that you think would be interesting to try in Seattle, like what that would be, and if you would like people's perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it was the combination of the last two, Boston and Denver, where I think Denver, oh, sorry, I guess maybe a combination of all three, because in one of them, there's no EDG, but then they have this like set checklist that I thought was interesting, where it's like, you don't need to do EDG. It's just this list of, let's say, 10 items that have to be met. That does cut out that phase, but there is still an offering of like an optional, if you do want more feedback, you can take this other track. So I think the way that prescriptive versus non-prescriptive, and one thing I thought was interesting is the idea of like requiring these checklists or requirements based on the project scale, where we do look at kind of design guideline priorities based on the project, but maybe there's a way to do like just a very broad like priority items per scale that maybe could be, maybe that's a checklist for some of them, and maybe there's a way to reduce times with that. But I don't know, these are all just kind of questions that I'm starting to, yeah, I think it's interesting, and I'm really interested in hearing other people's thoughts or questions or things that stood out to them, or other studies or questions that maybe could give us more insight. But yeah.
And Rocky dropped in the chat a piece about of information that would be interesting about the cost of housing. I think we talked earlier about, is there a way to get a sense of permit times for any of these cities? I don't know if you have an idea of how difficult that would be to ask or figure out.
I'll let Shelley add to this, but I know because all of like the processes are different, the legislative like body governing piece is different. There would just be so many variables that would have to be kind of accounted for. So I'm not the data person in that way with the numbers, but maybe there would be a way to just like account for that variable while still looking at the broad, like start to finish, just curious, like what that would be. In this I guess timeline that we're on, we definitely didn't have the capacity to do that. But with more time, that, I mean, I think that's something that I'm curious about as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Crystal is saying. I think it would take, you know, quite honestly, more time and funding for us to be able to hire a consultant to do that work. We talked about looking into that. We tried looking at the different cities' websites to see if we could find some information, even just about, for instance, how many projects did they review in a set amount of time, and even that took many hours, and we got nowhere. So yeah, so it's a fascinating question. But we'd have to figure out what things do we want to measure, because our process is quite different from other cities. For instance, as I'm sure a lot of you know, in other cities, you have to go through your discretionary review entitlement before you can apply for your building permit. Seattle lumps them together. Seattle has an EDG phase, a lot of other cities don't. So we'd have to figure out, what are we measuring? How are we measuring it? And then get funding and a consultant to be able to do that work. But I agree, it's a fascinating question.
And Todd has an interesting suggestion to compare timelines in Bellevue and Seattle. I don't know if that is also too much apples and oranges, but that there's a sense that the people in the community work in both jurisdictions. So possibly even anecdotally, there's that kind of idea. I don't know how people feel about that.
A little bit of that information will actually be in the other report that we're working on finishing up with community attributes. But what they found was that Bellevue publishes their numbers only related to commercial development going through design review. So that's different from what we're really focusing on, the housing, and also it doesn't give the full picture of all of their design review projects. But I don't want to take up discussion time, just wanted to provide that little
John?
Yeah, thanks for that information, Crystal. I'm reminded of Chris's earlier comment. And perhaps, and I recognize what you were saying, Shelley, that really parsing this would take a great deal more time. But if we frame it the way Chris did earlier, there must be an initial start of a process to get a building permit. What is the time involved in that from the very first application to the time the building permit is issued or the land use permit? So instead of perhaps being over interested in comparables and trying to align things that aren't necessarily aligned, it seems that the big thing that others have asked for as well is what's the overall duration of time? And that may not be as hard to get, and that might be a useful metric to have, is from the very first application to the end of all the reviews, what's that comparable, or how does that go in cities without necessarily worrying about parsing it too much or parsing it the least amount possible.
Crystal, you want to respond?
Yeah. And now, like, this is making me kind of think about the, even just looking at this, right, without knowing the duration, when we're looking at the cities that have different components, we can start to say, well, they don't have this phase. So that is cutting out time. Do we agree, or do we think it's helpful the way that they are approaching it? So there's no EDG, but they are looking at this prescriptive list. Is that something we think is valuable or not? So even, yeah, that's, and I think just thinking about like Grace's comment too of the, you know, we can infer kind of some things of like, yeah, there's not an EDG phase, so that does cut out time, but there are different ways that they're doing it. So even us not having that information, what are the kind of questions that we can begin to ask? But yeah, these are really good comments, so thank you.
And just to highlight what Shelley dropped in the chat, curious if the other ideas for other cities that have an equity focus and process steps of design review. I think if you could just maybe recap, Crystal, the sort of equity piece, that it's just really beginning for most cities. Nobody is really out in front on the incorporation of equity into design review, correct?
Yes, that was my overall like big high level take. And I would say like us going through this process, everyone here today has the opportunity, and this is the potential to be like, yeah, I was integral and part of Seattle being a leader in this. So I think that's, you know, something to be like proud of, and to hopefully like, you know, take, that's a big responsibility, but it's also, again, I think Seattle is a leader in policies and progressive planning work. And so it's keeping that in the forefront as much as we can. And I know like from my side, it's hard, like it is hard. But maybe if we can look at it from that way of like, we're here to figure out how we can move things forward in both the process. So like, are there pieces that can fall away? Sure. And maybe like there's readjustment. So it's just like, what are the base pieces? How can some pieces move away, but other pieces are maybe doubled down on. So that's kind of like just looking at even this chart, the way I'm starting to look at it as like, these are all just components. So what components can fall away and what other ones then need to be strengthened to make up for that? So maybe that's a question.
Okay, and I see the comments from both Rocky and Chris in the chat. Any other comments or observations people want to bring up before we move into kind of our last element? So it would be good checklist for smaller projects, exempt, yep. Okay, any last minute comments staff want to make, or? Thank you. And the full report will go out to folks soon, or did we send that out on Wednesday? Oh, you're on mute.
Already sent it. Yeah, we sent it last week.
Okay, so the things that are noted in the chat about ideas, we will capture that in our overall response, and just sort of, again, to think about ways that improvements can be made to both address process and equity. Double down on community outreach for larger projects, but leave the design critique element of the project design to professionals. Okay, great. Remember that, Rocky. We're gonna have you come back to that at the very end. Okay. So the last piece of this is the focus conversations that we had with just everybody on this call. What we'd like to do here is just give you a quick overview of the methodology and why we took this approach. Broadview Planning came in October and had to try to help figure out how to stitch the pieces together to have a response to the slide. So next slide, please. So when we came on board, one of the things that we wanted to do, because it is yet another approach to trying to get input and information, was to have these small group conversations. And we felt strongly that what was missing was also the perspective of staff, since they are a stakeholder in these process. So we wanted to do these focus conversations both with internal stakeholders, staff, and external stakeholders, which are all of you folks. So we had 4 groups of staff with 17 participants and 5 groups with all of you. And I will just want to say in advance, thank you for your time. I know people have spent a lot of time talking to you, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that people are anxious for dialogue. So it was a great opportunity. I always thought that these 90-minute sessions were going to wrap up early, and they tended to go longer. So we had 3 standard poll questions that we asked across all groups, all of these 9 focus conversations. And then we had a somewhat standard script that we allowed to sort of deviate along the path of where people were most interested in exploring addressing equity and also process improvements. So some of these groups really honed in on how well or not well design review boards are functioning. Some were about design guidelines, some were about just fundamental process improvements. And so it was very interesting to sort of hear how different people were thinking. And it was also very interesting to hear the conversation that happened in and among groups, not just to us, but with each other. So next slide. What we're doing with all of this. So organizing the results of these conversations. So again, our primary focus, Broadview Planning coming in at this moment, was to identify barriers to implementing a RET process. So after Paradigm Shift left in October, it's very clear that we're not in a space to be able to really conduct a legitimate racial equity toolkit process. And why is that? So that's where we are focusing a lot of our attention. That said, there is a ton of expertise in this room, and people have committed a lot of time and energy. And so we have gathered all of the insights and recommendations related to both equity improvements and process improvements, and have created this tool, which is turning out to be pretty massive, that has insights and recommendations organized by category from all of the interviews that everyone has done with community attributes or Paradigm Shift, all of the focus conversations, all of the recommendations coming out of departures analysis in the permit times report, the community attributes report on housing costs, and then the previous RET analysis that happened on the virtual meetings for design review. So we are about a little over halfway through of that, and we have about 218 line items so far. These will all be organized by the following kind of buckets: barriers to the RET process, transparency and access to power, design guidelines, land use and other codes, program design and review processes, design review boards, and outreach and engagement. So that is just a broad brush of how we're organizing these things. There are themes that are showing up already, and there are obviously lots of recommendations that are coming. So what I want to do right now is just have turn this over to Valerie, and we're going to just give you an overview of what we heard and then where we are in kind of creating recommendations. And like I've said before, we do want to come back to this group in some form to talk about recommendations and get insight on this. So I'm not turning it over to Valerie yet. I'm doing this. These are the things that we heard from you folks, and these are the Slido polls that everybody did. So this was standard across all groups, and they are sort of compared by external stakeholders, which is all of you folks, versus the internal stakeholders on the right side. And we asked in 1 to 2 words, what's the purpose of Seattle Design Review Program? And you can see how things kind of differed between internal and external stakeholders. The larger the word, the more times it was repeated. We felt it was very important for people to have a chance to use their own words. So these will all be in the back of our report. The next question we asked, and we will send this all out to all of you folks, which is another word cloud, which is what words would you use to describe your vision of a design review program that achieves both racial equity and design excellence? And again, you can see external responses on the left and internal on the right. So getting a lot into accountability and transparency. I mean, that comes up over and over again, and came up also over and over again in conversations. More engagement, more diverse perspectives, predictability again is another big, a big input. So that was one of the 2 questions we asked that formed these word clouds. And then the third question we asked across all of these focus conversations was, what does racial equity mean in the context of design review, in your own words? So these are just a sample of what we heard. And I think sort of a representative sample. A lot felt like it was sort of valuing and respecting neighborhoods and communities that are served. A lot of difficulty in forming an answer to this response, which is just fine. There's a lot of getting into material quality, neighborhood responsiveness, and contribution to the community. Hard question to address. A process that provides equal opportunity for participation from the single family homeowner to the commercial developer needs to be less complex to allow for everyone to participate. We're running out of time, so I don't want to read all of these verbatim, but I think I'll dwell on the last one, which is community voices are heard and BIPOC voices are elevated. So again, this is just kind of a representative sample of the input that we received in people's own words that we will add as an appendix to the final report. But this was a struggle, a question that folks really did struggle with. So next slide, Valerie.
Yeah, so in these focused conversations, some key themes emerged. I'm going to highlight first the themes from the internal stakeholders, the staff, and then the themes from the external stakeholders, all of you. For staff, we found that their staff members are bright, they're engaged, they're deeply committed to the program, but almost universally, they recognize that things aren't perfect. Process improvements need to be made, and they have lots of ideas for improving the program. We also found that design review has to absorb or have accountability for a lot of the non-design related comments that come in through various challenges or channels, and specific to the rate of growth and development. And so this has changed over time and worsened in the past 5 or so years. Staff members want to keep review as simple as possible. They're cognizant of the fact that there are often too many cooks in the kitchen, and then too many layers of review that have been added over the years. They also recognize that it's very challenging to focus on racial equity over process improvements when equity isn't truly and meaningfully part of the design review process. There's also a lack of understanding about the intent of design review and the need for education across the board from the public to elected officials. Staff members also noted that attending a design review board meeting doesn't constitute meaningful public engagement. And there should be more engagement and accountability for the city as well as for developers. Outreach should happen early and at multiple points of the process. And there seems to be a structural disconnect between SDCI and the Department of Neighborhoods. And if true engagement and accountability to the public are priorities, as we say, then responsibility for managing EDG outreach shouldn't live exclusively with DON. Many stakeholders also wanted to restructure the design review board meetings to make them more productive and meaningful. Switching to the themes we got from you all, we heard that Seattle is better off with design review than it would be without it. There was near consensus that design review is a force for good. Only one person said they wanted to eliminate design review entirely. Everyone else says that the process is broken, but they're hoping to be meaningfully engaged to help fix it. They also noted that community engagement at board meetings can usually be boiled down to views and parking. People show up to these meetings and they're told that this isn't the appropriate venue for their concerns. And so they leave frustrated and then become soured to all city engagement processes. Some felt a general sense that design review affects housing affordability, but there's limited data to substantiate this. And then we wondered if this is true, if design review does affect housing affordability, how could we ensure that cost savings get passed on to the people who live there? We also heard over and over that the amount of paperwork and documentation required for correction cycles is costly and cumbersome. Next, the design review program seems insufficiently staffed. In a city that's growing as quickly as Seattle, design review needs more staff and resources. And we heard that staff and board members may need more training and education so that decisions are consistent, timelines are predictable, and nothing feels arbitrary. Many people noted the missed opportunities throughout the design review program and how things are being executed now. Rather than an adversarial relationship, we heard that there are missed opportunities for collaboration between city staff and developers who ostensibly both want to make the city more vibrant and welcoming. And then another missed opportunity, rather than tick the box engagement, there are opportunities to build community capacity so community members can meaningfully engage in the development of their neighborhoods. Moving from those themes, we're now going to talk about some of the findings. We really wanted to elevate this from the paradigm shift report. There are two anchor requirements for a racial equity toolkit analysis. First, we should prioritize transformational change. This includes all decision-making processes over merely relying on transactional change, which is focusing on the products of decision. Second, we should be analyzing how white supremacy culture contributes to these racial inequities and identifying what cultural changes need to be made. Paradigm Shift highlighted this. We came back to this over and over throughout our conversations, and so we just wanted to include this quote from their report. Specifically, our recommendations seek to combat a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency drives us to focus on timelines and getting it done over investing in relationships and change that can transform systems and outcomes. It also leads us to not look at the whole picture of contributing factors, to success or failure. And so one thing we want to highlight right now is our findings to barriers to completing a RET analysis. First, relationships are broken and there's a severe lack of trust. Without rebuilding that trust, there's no path for transformational change. There's also no clear design review program. And without a distinct program with a vision, goals, and objectives, there's no real way to measure progress. This includes both process improvements and racial equity. There's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings about what the stakeholder committee process would be and how input would be used. A few notes on this. This process began with outcomes already created, and so there was a missed opportunity to build a meaningful and collaborative process. Many people on the committee also felt that their time wasn't respected and their professional reputation was on the line. And then aggressive and unrealistic timelines to complete this process and respond to the SLI did more harm to relationships than to advance the conversation on equity and process improvements. And then we also noted that there's no indication that the city at its very highest levels is interested in or committed to transformational change. This includes the city acknowledging the need for process amendments and committing to embedding equity into design review. Andrea?
Okay, wait, I'm gonna go back to that real quick. Because the next part I would want to get into asking some questions, but I just want to just pause and ask if there's any questions or comments or reflections on kind of both of these themes and early findings that we just talked about. Grace.
I just wanted to clarify, these findings were findings of the current Broadway planning team, or were they, okay, thank you.
Yes, from us. Any other questions or comments? Most of you participated in these, so also be curious to hear your perspectives. But I'm going to jump to the next slide because we have a question we would want to ask you. Like Valerie said, we were really focused on the early findings for the barriers to completing a REP process. But the other two things that we wanted to dig into with just a little bit of time here today are the findings around outreach engagement and then the process improvements. So what we heard was that the city needs a process to improve community engagement and take the pressure off design review meetings as the only place where the city routinely engages with community and bears the brunt of that brunt of being the only place. In thinking a little bit about how that has changed over time, there was a pretty significant dismantling of community councils and neighborhood councils, for better or for worse, about the same time that people seem to indicate that things got worse with design review. And again, this is now the only place where the city routinely engages with community. And so we were at a couple of different interviews, we talked about sort of picking that apart a little bit and what that means. So currently, meetings aren't seen as equitable design review board meetings or of value to BIPOC communities, but neither is the absence of these meetings. So what changes could be made from your perspectives? And this is one example that we heard that we thought was pretty interesting and would like to just explore this with all of you. A pilot program where the city invests in the CDA in every neighborhood so that they can do the hyperlocal and equitable engagement, including childcare, translation, interpretation, food, and it makes the city and developers more accountable to community. So that's a pretty significant pilot program, a significant recommendation. So I'm curious, thoughts on that, or if you have other ideas that you would think would be a good way to improve outreach and engagement.
I'm not exactly sure what this pilot program entails, but I like the idea of it. I would say that it's important for people to understand kind of what the parameters of design review are before they show up at the meeting, right? So if they show up at the meeting because somebody has told them, hey, this is really important in our community, go, they still don't know what the issues are, what they should be talking about. And I feel like it's, and I don't know the right solution because as I'm about to say this, like, I don't know what would compel somebody to show up for this, but I feel like it's sort of urban planning 101 or design review 101 that happens over a longer period of time so that the community in general can understand, like, what's the point of design review? What are the types of things that are reviewed and discussed? What are the kinds of comments that are going to be heard and appreciated, or where this is not the right venue, right? So somebody said earlier, it's frustrating, or maybe it was in the notes, people get frustrated when they show up wanting to complain about parking and views, and then they think, oh, the city process, it's never, they never listen to us. Along the same lines, there are people that show up to these meetings and they are making constructive comments, and either design review board or the planner will dismiss their comments as not being pertinent or relevant or even important enough for the design team to take into consideration. So I think there's like a lot of unpacking of why that happens, but I think the education or the sort of ways to engage the community, like, I don't know what, if I was a, community member that wasn't in the design profession, I don't know why I would take the time to drag my kids to something in my neighborhood when I just don't have the time or skills or bandwidth to add one more thing.
And do you think investing in sort of a long-term engagement approach would change that over time? Or are we hopeful that that would?
I'm hopeful that it would. And so here's the thing that I think about. And I don't know how the city does it, but like, I think there's lots of people who have concerns and, questions and things about also about density and massing and things like that. They don't know how to articulate these things. And people show up at the wrong meeting for, to voice their concerns about the wrong things because they don't understand that SDOT is only caring about these things and that design or SDCI only cares about these things. And I remember being at one meeting that the city held at Optimism on Capitol Hill where there was SDOT and like 2 or 3 other organizations, and they were there just to generally listen to community concerns about stuff in the neighborhood. I mean, that I don't know if anybody ever looked at that, analyzed that, evaluated whether that was effective or not, but as a community member going to that, I was impressed that it happened and that there wasn't about a specific problem, but people could just come and just generally voice concerns. And I think that they were kind of sharing like, here's the capital projects in your neighborhood that will be coming out sometime in the next year or 2. But I feel like more of those kinds of things so people can understand. Like I've told people, community members, design review is not your time to come and talk about some of these issues. Like it's actually the comp plan. And nobody wants to come out and talk about the comp plan. Like that is just an opaque process. But that's actually where people would be more meaningful engaged. So how do you try to figure out venues for it to be not just when the comp plan is being updated, but periodically throughout the year, kind of like the home repair work fairs or whatever the city had used to do prior to COVID. Like how can you do a community thing where people could come and learn about how to, in that case, I think it was like how to remodel your house and getting resources and learning about rebates or, other city programs. But how can you do that about general planning and I don't know. I don't have an answer.
No, and I think, okay, Gladys, I see your hand is up, but it does feel like there are 2 critical paths that need to happen. The city needs to sort of take responsibility for. There is this design review process, which is focused and local and has improvements, but there is this engagement with community that is missing and is not coordinated. And it's not that people shouldn't show up to meetings and have their voices not heard or told that this isn't appropriate place to have these comments. There needs to be a forum to understand and engage with community on that level. And then the education piece can happen around that and where is the best place to show up. So Gladys and then Patrick.
So I think that example is actually happened with a EDI fund that funded by the city, and that the engagement is with, here it says CDA, but that point is that is with a local group that actually know the community really well. And then I think is the idea of that is not like, it's not like really tied to a design review process. The idea is that you have long-term engagement with the community, then with the community, with the information kind of the meetings organized by somebody local, then you would actually through over time, then you would find like you have the community understand the issues with their own language, with their own time frame. And then when the design review actually happens, then it's that moment in time process, they will be able to, they have the capacity and the knowledge of their own community to be able to kind of give feedback in a meaningful way. So I think that is, it is that the benefit of a long term engagement, being able to kind of have the language and have the understanding of their own neighborhood. So it's an investment into a community, which then the leader of this process is not the city, it's the local CDA or local community.
Okay, so the leader of the process is the local CDA, local community, but that there is a strong enough relationship that has been built with sort of access to the city and understanding, and there is a sort of a conduit for that. Thank you. Patrick.
Yeah, maybe building a little bit on what you just said, Grace. we've certainly found tremendous success with communities where you go to the LRC and you explain the process to them, you explain the project and have a conversation. And nobody, I don't care who you are, nobody likes to go to a meeting with a problem or with a question and being told, no, you can't solve that problem, or no, I can't answer that question, or no, this isn't the right forum. So it seems to me that one of the formulas, and maybe it is not the city, maybe it's like you're saying, Grace, that we're here tonight to talk about this project. Here are the things that we can affect. Here are the things that you need to be concerned about. Here are the things that we can address that answer your questions if you have them, so that it becomes a constructive thing. We're here to communicate. We're here to answer questions. We're here to address issues. And yes, there are limitations in that, but that at least you've defined a pathway to getting some kind of progress or some kind of constructive conversation going, so that it's not, it's not what I think a lot of people are experiencing now, which is, no, I can't answer that, or no, that's not appropriate, or no, we're not going to talk about views or parking or those kinds of things. So at least it kind of defines, it's a little Pollyannish, I agree, but at least we kind of found some kind of opening to the conversation that says this can be a constructive process, and one that does build a relationship over time, hopefully.
And a sense of curiosity between institution and community, I think, would be, I mean, we're all here because we like planning and the built environment. Like, it would be great to be able to imbue that sense into community. And I will say, one of the things that I'm surprised with is, I think by sheer number of comments and insights and recommendations, outreach and engagement is probably by far where people had the most to say. So it's taken us a lot of time to chew on that a little bit. And it's a thing that we want to think through some recommendations and bring back to you. But this really is, and yes, potentially it is tied to process improvements, but it is really fundamentally about the piece about equity here. And like, as it says here, they're not working necessarily well, but the absence of them is not going to make it better. So what do we do in that? And like, how do we create a process with that change in mind? Any other comments before we just have one other finding we want to just throw out at all of you? Okay, let's do the next one. Okay, so process improvements. There is broad acknowledgement that there are a lot of options for improving process to increase predictability and improve review timelines. So I'm curious from all of you, and again, we will sort through these and bring them back as recommendations. What process change do you think would most meaningfully improve design review? And in your answer, you have to also think about who would benefit and who would be burdened by that change. So an example here is, does design review become an entirely administrative review process? Who benefits and who burdens? So there were some examples of changes that were brought in the chat a while ago. If you want to dig those back up and make your statement again, I'm curious who would like to take ownership of their most favorite process change they'd like to see happen. Maria.
I would like to see design review boards eliminated and have the design checklist that was referenced, because I think that increases predictability. I don't know that, at least I don't know that anyone in this group, maybe I'm wrong, disagrees that having design guidelines to influence design in different neighborhoods and communities should be eliminated. I think it's a fine thing. I have the objection, huge objection, to design review boards that most often are way too subjective and personal in their comments. So having just the design guidelines and the checklist, and you can meet them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fairly easy thing to do. We get it. We can meet them. I think that would be good. And eliminate the boards themselves. And then on top of that, if the issue is so much about community input, then let's have a more robust process to get community, at least have the opportunities for community members to show up and discuss their concerns or issues with a new project coming into their neighborhood.
Okay, so eliminating design review boards. Who benefits from that and who is burdened by that? And all of you who just chimed in on the chat are welcome to answer as well.
I guess I don't see anyone being burdened by it in my.
I echo Maria. I don't see anyone being burdened by it. I think everyone benefits from it. And to reiterate what Maria said is kind of separating the two, you know, the community issues away from design review, which is a technical board, is a good idea. So eliminating design review is a great idea, Maria, and I completely support that.
I hear you, and I would like to ask you to be super articulate in who you mean by everyone.
The design team, the city staff, the developer, and the community, and everyone.
Would all benefit.
Yes.
Okay.
And the planners, because they don't have to take these notes where, to Maria's earlier point, the design review board's, you know, suggestions are very subjective. They can adhere to the checklist that allows them to be objective about decision making.
Okay, so that's two comments on benefits. How about the burdens? Who is, or I would say, who is impacted if there is the design review boards go away?
I mean, it seems to me if the boards go away, it's like you still need the planner. I mean, someone still needs to sort of evaluate these checklists, right? I mean, I think there's still a level of sort of subjectivity, even if you rewrite guidelines, and I mean, whatever guidelines, current or future, there's still an interpretation. So I guess I would see it as a burden to SDCI or the planner, whoever is now empowered or in charge of saying, yes, we think this, you know, adequately, you know, these are the right guidelines, and we think your EDG or whatever it is, you know, is in line with or is meeting these guidelines. So there is some entity still needs to do that. Right now, we're using local boards and this community process as a means of having that discussion, right, wrong, or indifferent. So again, if we're sort of saying, let's get rid of the public boards and these boards because, you know, they are too unpredictable, there's too much personal sort of lens being put to it, I guess it goes back to the planners. And my gut is that there's probably, it would require hiring more staff at the city to adequately get through this. And so, you know, I think that would be a burden. And I would be worried about, personally, I think, again, going back to the data of the timeline of some of this, I personally think that there is some culprit or cause of this is just lack of city staff being able to get through it. Just as architects and developers are not sitting on their hands when the ball is in their court, I don't believe the city's just sort of sitting on their hands when the ball's in their court either. I just think that there's too many projects and not enough staff to get through it.
Yeah.
And so I do worry a little bit about putting more on their plate without acknowledging at least that there probably needs to be more people.
I appreciate that. And I do like some of the things that throwing into the mix from Sharon, like maybe there's a community designer that's part of the process that can be that kind of go between, but the sort of that community piece being burdened. Grace.
I guess I am not sure that I'm in favor of dismantling design review boards, only from the standpoint if it is a checklist that is at, you know, with the planner at the city, and it's their own one person's subjective idea. Like design is not a subjective thing. It's like everybody has their own opinion, and all those opinions can be different. And I think that as a designer, I will say the value that I've seen on my projects and others is when you get to have sort of, it's like the design critique that we had in architecture school. You have all these differing opinions. And I'm saying this for the boards that are actually functional and having dialogue versus some other boards maybe who don't have that capacity or knowledge to do that. But I think it's important for the community to see and understand what are the conversations that are being had. That transparency is really important. And so if you do it with a checklist behind closed doors at SDCI, nobody gets to understand or see the conversations, the negotiations that might be happening. That all feels very opaque and very unequitable. And so I think the public component is important as long as there can be meaningful dialogue.
Maria, quickly, because then I want to get to John and Katie.
Why don't you go to John and Katie and come to me last then, because they haven't spoken.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. John?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Yeah, I'm not for dismantling design review boards. Obviously, I think improvements could be made. My major impact I see from a community perspective is design review provides some transparency, as Grace said, some public dialogue, which I think is important, but also presents milestones that can be tracked from a community perspective. There are these certain watershed meetings and hearings that are important and allows communities to better plug into the process.
Thank you. Katie.
Hi, so I just wanted to sort of maybe frame this a little bit and give people a little bit more to chew on in terms of like process improvements in design. So first of all, we've sort of parsed out the two major like overlapping aspects of project design, that being and how they impact equity. So the first really being considering how equity is in how a project is developed. So that's like your programming, the intended users, is it affordable? Do you get the retail that actually serves community in place? Is it bringing about gentrification? That is, right, as we have discussed, unfortunately, all outside of the realm of design review. And so what we're really talking about here is equity in design. By that, I mean what a building looks like. So if we limit our focus to that, the question then becomes, how can marginalized, underrepresented communities, particularly lower income communities, BIPOC communities, have an impact on the look of that building and how the design of a building helps those communities feel like they belong in their neighborhood, that the local culture and history, that the racial context is integrated into those buildings. And so like when we're thinking about who is it benefiting and who is it burdening, I encourage you to keep that in your mind in terms of how we are framing equity in design review and design outcomes. I also want to point out, and some people said this in the chat, that many people don't care until they're forced to care. They don't have time, they don't have the money until it's impacting their neighborhood, and often for the reasons that are outside of the actual design of the building, more about the programming. So how can we integrate equity into the process so that we're not always depending on our already overworked communities, our BIPOC communities, our low income communities who don't have the time and money or emotional energy to continue showing up time and time again? How can we just better integrate it fully into the process? So I'll leave you with those questions to chew on.
Okay, Maria, then Sharon, and then Frank, and then we're going to wrap up.
So I'm responding to your question about who is burdened by eliminating the boards. And I have to say, I still don't believe anyone is burdened because there are design guidelines, whether there is a board or not a board. The outcomes or the community input and outreach and their involvement in what they think the look should be is in many ways irrelevant with the board or without a board, because you have to meet the design guidelines. And so if someone says, I want you to do X on your building, and it's not a requirement in the guideline, it's not going to happen. So I think that part of it should be taken aside because it's not a relevant burden. I want to go back to my comment that beefing up community input and having community meetings and making sure the community understands, I totally 100% support. I just wanted to make sure. So that's why I don't see how anyone would be burdened with design guidelines. Now, if you want to go and talk about, let's change the design guidelines, let's throw them out the door and start over, that's a different matter. But I guess, you know, we're kind of putting in new concepts into the design guidelines, which is what I believe we were talking about. That's
Well, can I ask you a question about that? Like, I'm curious, like if the meaningful engagement from the community is to get input, and say a community member came back and said, I would like your building to be purple, and you say, no, it's red. What do you do with that conversation piece? Like, what do you do with that input? Do you meet halfway? Do you paint the
Nope.
building different colors? You
know,
do.
I have a lot of community outreach, and our company does a ton of it. And there's nothing you can do if someone wants you to change a color. That is subjective. One person in the community is not going to drive the color of my building. It's just not. Now, if 20 people say you need to change the color because in this community, purple is a very important color to our ethnic makeup or our BIPOC community, then absolutely I would listen. But it's context, right?
Okay, well, I think that's what I was looking for, is like, if you are the commitment to community engagement, but then, I mean, you clearly have a commitment to listening, but how does that show up? So that is a great example, and I appreciate that.
Right, when one person says they want me to chop off 2 floors, I can't. If 20 people say we are concerned about the height and the canyon effect, I can listen to that and do something about that by stepping the building back or reconfiguring. So there's things you can listen to if it's a group, you know, if numerous people have the same concern, I always address it. I can't address one person's concern in a meeting with 30 people. I just can't.
I appreciate that perspective. Thank you. That was a good example. Sharon, Frank, and then we're gonna wrap, and I'm gonna try not to go over.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I think as long as there's a board, we're not shifting the power dynamic. And I think if we can give the CDAs the power to do the outreach, then we are shifting that power dynamic. And we're giving it to the community to get the input that they need, and they can get it effectively. I've sat in on too many board meetings where you have to have, where the discussion between the board members based on their expertise goes in a very ineffective way, and therefore it becomes a burden on everybody that was there that night. It really has to be a perfect conversation in order to make the meeting effective, which rarely happened the way it currently is. So I feel like putting it with the CDA, but also having a community designer that works with SDCI that is associated with that CDA, everyone's compensated for what they do. Then that thoughtful community planner, I know that's going to be hard to find for every CDA, but can bring back the relevant information to the planner, and then we can just eliminate that process, but know that the community's been able to have the meeting that they want the way they want it.
Thank you. Okay, Frank, last comment, please.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna comment on something that Katie had mentioned earlier, as far as like limiting the scope of the conversation and the questions that are being asked to design review in particular, because I think it was Crystal who mentioned in her presentation that you know, community engagement, community input is sort of wrapped up with equity or design review as a part of equity in most of the examples that she saw. And I think for that reason, it's difficult for me to like pull that apart and just say, okay, you know, design review and how is equity concerned here, especially when that's the only opportunity that the general public has for these sorts of developments. And so again, I mean, I think it's difficult to sort of separate, and I understand a lot of the issues that are brought up here as far as like design review being fairly separate from that process, or maybe needing to be or should be, but just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to have Valerie close out the PowerPoint so I can see everybody. So again, this was a lot of information, and just again, I think just a tip of the iceberg, and we're continuing to refine inputs and recommendations, inputs and insights to get to these recommendations. So the question on the table from the beginning was, does this group potentially, because we gotta talk to SDCI about this, want to meet another time to have a more robust conversation about recommendations, more similar to the way we're sort of ending this meeting? or do we want a Word document to go out and be edited and have those comments come back to us? So show of hands, people who feel really great about meeting another time to talk about recommendations. I see 3, 4. Sharon, okay, 5, 6, okay. The other thing is we can have that conversation with the people who want to participate and not necessarily everybody. How about show of hands, people who would like to edit a Word document and have comments back to us? I see 1, 2, wait, 1, 2, okay, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Well, potentially we will do both, maybe. I'll talk to Shelley about that. We all have different learning styles and engagement styles. So we'll talk to Shelley about that. We'll get back to all of you. And then we are on the hook, we, CCI and boundary planning, to give a kind of an interim report to Councilmember Strauss by the end of this month, maybe slightly sooner than that. So this will be a bit modified from what we've presented to you. We're also going back to staff to present what we heard from all of those. And so that's what we're going to be busy working on for the next couple of weeks. And then we will get back to you very soon about maybe scheduling another meeting and then also a Word document for people to edit. Tejal, do you have one last quick comment, question? Question would be preferable.
I don't. I forgot to lower my hand.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Shelley, last words?
I just wanted to thank everyone for your participation, and yeah, it was a great conversation and I really appreciate hearing from everyone. And I just put a quick note in the chat, just noting that I am unfortunately not the person who will get to decide the future of this timeline. So I'll check in with Nathan Torgelson, and we can check in with Councilmember Strauss to make sure that we'll be able to find some time for the group to be able to see the draft document before it goes to Land Use Committee and possibly meet. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, and I would echo Shelley, and I really appreciate this conversation and all this input. And it's a lot to think about, and appreciate your time. So with that, we're going to end 2 minutes early, and we will be in touch with all of you very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Great discussion today.
Thank you.
Thanks.